Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody joining us from around the world. So welcome to today's webinar on space economy and investment, which is hosted by the IAF Space Economy Committee, together with the Workforce Development and Young Professional Program Committee, in the frame of the new initiative, which is the IAF Technical Committee's webinar series. My name is Eleonora Lombardi. I'm head of department at the Amaldi Foundation and vice chair for technical activities of the Workforce Development and Young Professional Program Committee at the IAF, and I'll be your moderator today. But before starting, let me thank who made it possible. So starting from the IAF governance and the IAF secretariat, with a special mention and thanks to Stefano Pascali for coordinating the organization of the webinar, as well as to the Workforce Development and Young Professional Program Committee members, with a special mention and thanks to Claudio Miai Tagliato, who is Vice Chair of the IAF Support Committee, and of course to the IAF Space Economy Committee members for the availability and engagement today. So starting with a brief introduction of the committee hosting the webinar today, the Space Economy Committee is dedicated to advancing a comprehensive and data-driven understanding of the space economy, from in-space operations to their interaction with terrestrial markets. Through collaborations with stakeholders across policy, finance, and industry, the committee works to shape global standards, bridges data gaps, and promotes socio-economic benefits of space across diverse regions. Today, we are very excited to welcome 6 outstanding members of the committee, thought leaders in space strategy, economics, and investment, who will share their perspective on how the space sector is evolving and what it means for entrepreneurs, investors, and institutions alike. So very big round of digital applause for our speakers. We have with us Dr. Bhavya Lal, professor at the Rand School of Public Policy and former acting chief of staff at NASA. Charlotte Mathieu, head of the Industrial Policy and Space Economy Division at the European Space Agency. Luigi Scatteia, partner at PwC Advisor and global thought leader in space economics and market foresight. Victoria Carter-Cortez, space strategy consultant at PwC and expert in investment strategy and venture design. Dr. Alessandro Paravano, assistant professor and researcher at Politecnico di Milano, focusing on space sector innovation and entrepreneurship. And last but not least, Meak Sarang, Director of Industry Integration of the Open Lunar Foundation, advancing governance and sustainable models in Cis-lunar space. So without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to our outstanding speakers, starting indeed with an introduction of the committee hosting today's webinar. So to Bhavya Lal, if you can introduce us the Space Economy Committee, what it is its scope, what are the new upcoming activities that you are planning for the future. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Eleonora. It's so great to be here. Thanks for having us. It's always so energizing to talk about something as vital and misunderstood as a space economy. I actually say misunderstood because people often assume that it's all rockets and billionaires, when in reality, it's weather models, a lot of job creation, a lot of economic development, chip innovation, even cancer cures. And yes, maybe a few billionaires too. So the Space Economy Committee, or the SEC, that this team represents, and it's an extraordinary team of experts from around the world, we are focused on understanding this full picture, how space activities contribute to national economies, global economy, global sustainability goals, and everything in between. I like to say we are data-driven, but people-minded. We think in metrics, but we care about meaning. So maybe I can say a little bit more here. So what do we do, really? So the Space Economy Committee exists to make sure that the space economy is, number one, well-defined, with shared definitions, metrics, and models, well measured, with reliable data that reflects reality, not hype. And as you know well, there's so much hype in the space sector these days. And third, well governed, with policies that support sustainable and equitable growth. Our scope is actually pretty wide, and that's on purpose. We examine established and emerging markets, from Earth observation and launch to space tourism, and as you'll learn more, the cis-lunar economy. We consider both in-space activities and their interactions with terrestrial industries, finance, agriculture, logistics, health. And then we connect the dots between policy, technology, economics, and human impact. So that's kind of what we do. And so what's new? And we have two young members of our committee to talk about it, but I'll give you a little bit of a preview. This year, the committee launched two major task forces, each tackling foundational gaps in the space economy. The first one, and Mehek and a subgroup of the SEC are working on it. They are working to define and map the emerging cis-lunar economy. What are the subsectors? Who are the early anchor customers? Where is investment flowing? And what value chains are beginning to take shape? And Mehak, I'm looking forward to hearing more about how things are going. And the second one is the ISAM task force that Victoria is leading and Alessandro is co-leading, and that's ISAM in space, servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. And actually, I think Moon Kim is also a co-lead. This task force is focusing on ISAM, which is what we call it, and the team aims to produce sort of a clear-eyed synthesis that can inform future policy, maybe potentially even anchor a global networking forum or a technical session at the IAC, and help investors and agencies better understand what ISAM is, what it needs to thrive. And in fact, both efforts reflect the core mission of the SEC to turn emerging economic narratives into usable insights and to support the development of international frameworks that are grounded in real data and not hype. And again, you've heard me now say this word multiple times. That is just, we are scientists and engineers and policy analysts, and there's that saying, in God we trust, all others bring data. Well, I would like God to bring data too. Anyway, we hope to share initial outputs at the IAC this October. So let me hand out to my team with a final comment. The SEC isn't just about studying the space economy, it's also about shaping it. Our job is to provide decision makers with frameworks that are grounded, globally inclusive, and forward-looking, and to ensure that the benefits of space, whether they're economic, societal, or scientific, they flow not just to a few countries or companies, but to all of us. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Bavia, for this introduction. So I see that you have a very strong and important mission. Indeed, you mentioned the activities you do in analyzing data, metrics, so making this space economy market very concrete. So remaining on this topic on how we measure the space economy, I would like to call on stage Charlotte. So from your activities within the committee and within your role, how do we actually currently measure the space economy and the impact of space programs? So if you can give us some insights on key metrics, methodologies, and data sources that guide your assessment. And also, second question, given the changes that we are seeing and experimenting in the space sector, how eventually, if these methodologies need to change?
Thank you, Eleonora, for these questions. I'll try to answer very briefly, and good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, I think what I can say is that we are trying indeed to measure two things, at least in our space economy team at the European Space Agency. First of all is indeed the measure of the space economy. And it's really about trying to understand what is the status and the main trends affecting an industrial sector, so the space industry, global and European. And the second thing is really trying to better assess the impact. We sometimes refer to socio-economic impacts of space programs, and in particular, in our case, the ESA programs. If I look at the measure of the space economy, we are really trying to have a better understanding of a number of elements. First of all, the public investment in space activities. Second, the private investment, and as part of the recent evolution, I think the rise of private investment in this sector is something that has led us to measure more and more the private investment. We look also into the different market and market revenues, and there again, the markets have been evolving quite significantly. And we have seen also some, let's say, the development, for example, of constellations, which are also changing the industrial landscape and the market landscape. And then we are also looking now into analysis of the competitiveness of the different industry. And I think this is something which is particularly important. We have quite a fierce competition also on the global space activities. So this is something we are looking at. We measure that. There is a small community of people looking into these questions of measuring the space economy, represented quite well in our committee, but we have really referenced organizations such as the OECD, and I can mention here the OECD Space Forum. On our European side, we work also a lot with the Eurostat, the Statistics Office, and the European Commission's Joint Research Center, looking at measuring the space economy through the statistics, the official statistics, with a thematic account, as was done by the BA in the US. Regarding the measure of the impact of space programs, there is quite a range of impacts that we are looking at, whether they are economic. This is one that we are being asked a lot about, whether this is about strategic impacts or societal impacts, scientific impacts, technological impacts. But I think what is important is really the approach and how to harmonize this assessment to make sure that we are comparing comparable impacts for a very diverse set of programs. If you are looking at the impact of the International Space Station, it's of a very different nature than the ones of specific technology programs. So this is to be taken into account. And I must say, in terms of evolution, certainly we have reinforced on our side the evaluation of economic impact, very important these days. We have looked also into the impact of the space programs on sustainability, which is also a key policy driver nowadays. We have looked into also the impact of the space activities on innovation. Space is a source of innovation. And last but not least, on our overall competitiveness. So these are examples of what we are trying to measure when we talk about space economy and impact of space programs, and now they have been evolving.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for this introduction on the metrics of the space economy. So I will take the point concerning how we also assess the socioeconomic impact of the space economy, addressing this question to Victoria. So as Charlotte was saying, the space economy is evolving beyond traditional domains and market sectors. So according to your experience, how should policymakers think about integrating socioeconomic goals such as sustainability and job creation into regional space strategies? Yeah. So no easy question.
Thank you very much for the question, Eleonora. And I think it's actually a very essential question that should be at the very core of any space strategy at national level. As we know, we've seen a decrease in the costs of developing space infrastructure in the last decade or so, and that's making access to space activities, technologies, applications much more accessible. We have over 80 countries now with space agencies and so on. But at the heart of the matter is the question of how should they invest invest in space, where should they target? And that's actually quite a key part of the work we do within PwC, is supporting nations in defining what a coherent space strategy is and how that should be developed. And the key principle of that is actually linking it to country needs that are beyond the space sector. So, are there needs in agriculture? Are the needs in disaster response? And how do space technologies, be that Earth observation imagery, satellite communications, GNSS, and beyond, how do they link? And how can you then measure return on investment in space domains and infrastructure within the country's broader economy? So tying back to the measurables, the KPIs, so to say, that Charlotte was explaining in terms of how we see the space economy, and that translating into job creation. And so in that frame, the Sustainable Development Goals are a good way of trying to frame, what a country might be focusing on. I mean, there are a big number of them, and every country, based on its geography, its geopolitical situation, may have a greater emphasis on need. And so they can use that as markers to then work backwards. So say we're focused on XYZ Sustainable Development Goal within the country. What technologies, what space elements can help grow the country in a coherent way. So I think that kind of relates to the answer. And that applies to emerging nations integrating themselves into the space ecosystem and becoming players there. But also when we look at future-looking technologies like ISAM, like exploring, lunar endeavors and so on, I think it's also relevant for more mature space nations that are trying to reach further beyond into areas where the market is not very mature, and making the case for the development of those kind of ecosystems.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Victoria. I see that we go back to the main two topics of the two task force that you have internally to your committee. So we'll be there in a couple of minutes. But before that, so both you and Charlotte mentioned this cross-sectors link between space and non-space. And I guess there are many lessons that we can derive. Also, we do not do space alone, so we need a lot of international cooperation within the space sector and specifically in the development of the space economy. So I would like to move on this topic together with Luigi and pulling back also Charlotte afterwards. So according to you, Luigi, what lessons do you think can be drawn from other sectors such as finance or infrastructure to help de-risk the investments in the space economy and also trying to build a resilient space value chain?
Well, thanks a lot to Leonora for the question, which is it's a complex one, and actually I might be a little bit provocatory here. And say that in the case of space, I think the main need is to really look very, very carefully at the space sector itself first and understand it very, very carefully first before looking at other sectors for lessons learned. This is on account of the fact that the space sector is basically a small sector of vast significance. I mean, as the others have said, there's multiple implications that space brings into other sectors. But the core space sector itself, so basically where the space industry actually operates and where the space industry actually survives, from the upstream to the downstream, it's not that big, right? And it's governed by very, very specific dynamics that are quite complex and quite unique. So I think the first very important thing is to really understand and appreciate all this, let's say, complex scenario of dynamics that regulate space, and for which you have very, very little actual comparison elsewhere in other domains or in other sectors. Then again, of course, space is also very, very diverse, right? I mean, we talk about space in general, but when we're looking at it with an economic and market lens, we are actually talking about a number of individual domains that are very, very, very different, regulated by very different dynamics, attached to very different external industries, if you want. And so in the end, if you go a little bit more in details, then maybe there is some stuff that you can look at for comparison. In this case, I mean, for example, if I take the domain of SATCOM, right? Satellite communication, for sure. I mean, there are some lessons learned let's say in telecom that can help understand how to de-risk substantial investments required, for example, for the deployment of satellite constellations and so on for SATCOM. So that's something that you can look at. For many other sectors, many other domains of space, actually a more close reference might be the defense sector on the other end. So rather than another economic sector of a more commercial nature. So it really, really depends, and it's difficult to generalize and come with a single lens on a sector like space.
All right, thank you very much, Luigi, for bringing your point of view. Yeah, going back a bit on the kind of cooperation we need in space, for space, and linking that again with the socio-economic impact and also how to match multilateral cooperation with sustainable economic activities. Again, Charlotte, what is your view and your understanding of this exchange between multilateral cooperation and sustainable economic activities in space?
Thank you, Eleonora. I think, first of all, we're not going to talk about multilateral international cooperation. Well, representing the European Space Agency, I think it shows how international cooperation is in the DNA of space activities. But I think when we talk about developing space activities, sustainable economic activities, as any other industrial sector, what this international cooperation should bring is really a proper framework to ensure the development of these activities and to make sure that this is sustainable, especially so when today when we are trying to develop more than ever commercial space activities. So the space activities require an environment that is as stable or as predictable as possible for this space economy to flourish. And per nature, this environment requires a multilateral cooperation. Just take one example of how this multilateral collaboration is bringing such a framework that allows sustainable space economy. Well, if I take, for example, the low Earth orbit, space is a shared location by all players internationally. We need collaboration to work together in that shared space and to develop sustainable activities. Well, the first example is to see how we can ensure safe and sustainable activities. And this is related to the questions of space traffic management, space weather, space debris. So there is a need for all the actors, and most of them are governments. Governments play a key role in space activities to work together to ensure that obviously we can make this environment as safe as possible for space activities to happen, that some guidelines, rules are developed. So if I take the example only of debris, which is a very well-known topic and which has an impact on the development of the activities in orbit, and this can obviously affect all type of application of space. There's a lot of work that is being done between the agencies, between the governments. I just want to highlight here an effort led by the European Space Agency, which is the Zero Debris Charter, which is really the idea to define ambitious and measurable space debris mitigation and remediation targets. And this has been launched 2 years ago, and we have now about 150 organizations, whether these are industry, companies, research centers, public organizations, as well as 19 countries, including some outside of Europe, that are working together to commit to try to make the space environment as sustainable as possible as regard debris. So I think the debris is really a good example of how this multilateral collaboration can actually ensure that the framework in which whatever space activities might be developing in orbit would be done in the most sustainable way possible.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Charlotte, for this point of view, because this allows us also to start moving on the in-space activities analysis. And indeed, as Bavia was mentioning at the very beginning, the Space Economic Committee is developing 2 task forces. And so my question goes to the lead of these 2 task forces, so both to Alessandro and Meac. Starting with Alessandro, so based on the activity that you do within this task force, how can we quantify the economic value of emerging industries, such as we said, in space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing activities? And yeah, which metrics will the task force prioritize? If you can give us some insights on what you foreseen within the task force.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Eleonora, for the question and for the invitation. So we decided to start this task force on this topic that is really, I mean, is gaining a momentum because it's a case, is a sector that is somehow useful to study and to develop methodologies that are useful to understand which is the value created by these new application, new companies that are coming in a context that is really emergent, but at the same time is uncertain. So there are some limitations on traditional methodologies, especially because we usually tend to measure something as an input, the investment or financing, or the output, the revenue. Here, in this case, there is a big challenge that who is going to take the value, to capture the value coming from this technology, and especially for stakeholders that don't exist, or could be stakeholders that are not really willing at the moment to invest and to get the benefits coming from this infrastructure. So we decided to start this work, first of all, understanding what. So what is ISAM? What are the boundaries? Because the perimeter of your analysis is fundamental if you have to take some measurement there. Who are the actors involved worldwide? What are the relationship, the connection? What are the exchanging? And also, what are the market segments at different stages of the space value chain, so upstream, downstream, but even end users, so companies that are non-space that can benefit from this kind of activities. Think, for example, to manufacturing, or, I mean, as also Bavia mentioned at the beginning, logistics, pharma, and so far and so forth. And then going to look at how they are evolving, but especially how they are creating value. So what are the business models that they're putting in place? What are the value creation mechanisms? And to do that, we're going to collect and analyze secondary and primary data, both qualitative and quantitative, in a way to have a kind of perspective and look also at what will be the future. So Charlotte at the beginning mentioned the trends. Looking at the trends, this is fundamental, especially in a topic like that. To figure out what are the opportunities and challenging. So what the company can do, company that are in ISAM, what the institution has to do, where do you have to invest, why? Because in this case, this kind of application, actually businesses have the ability to act as a platforms, as enablers for something new. So the idea is really to come to your second part of the question that is more connected to the KPIs, the metrics that we can use. It's really a matter of the level of analysis and to study step by step all the different dimensions in a scalable way, but at the same time try to do something that is really in depth. So what we are going to prioritize is, of course, first of all, the value coming from space, so the upstream sector itself, looking at metrics that are both tangible and intangible. So tangible could be the revenue generated by selling a product, a service, a technology, and this as well as intangible value that are, for example, knowledge. And this is something that many times we tend not to consider because it's difficult to quantify it, but it actually is becoming really fuel for this kind of emerging industry that are coming up. So the challenge will be also to get understanding how we can quantify this kind of intangible measurement. And then looking at different stages. So after identify the stakeholders, which is the value created, for whom try to figure out for the different verticals, so different application domains in the end user segments, where is the value, in a way that we can also provide a framework to the decision maker to decide whether to invest or not, how and why, especially in terms of economic returns. So this is mainly what we are going to do. And of course, is a work that started this year and will last for many years now. So we are also very open to feedback from all the community to get to understand how it's evolving, if we have to get some direction that could be more useful, I don't know, for institution, for agency, for companies, or even for end users. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro, and also thank you for this call for engagement from the community, which is also the reason why we decided to organize this webinar series. So if there is anyone interested in joining the activities that you launched this year, I mean, you are more than welcome to get in touch with the committee. And we will definitely need another webinar to see and for you to present the results of these studies.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then moving on the other task force that was mentioning before to define the Cis-lunar economy, I would like to call on stage MEAC. So what key demand signals are you monitoring to model growth in the Cis-lunar economy over the next 5-10 years? So how are you proceeding with these studies, and what would be the main activities of the task force as well from your side?
Excellent. Thank you for the question. So first of all, the reason that this task force is really relevant is that there's a lot of interest in this sector. We've already seen 3 different lunar missions launched this year, and we're projected to see over 100 lunar missions by 2030. So one thing that I want to note before we think about demand signals, one thing the task force is looking at is reducing risk as a potential barrier to unlocking meaningful commercial activity. So right now there is a really high barrier of entry because the cost and failure rate of lunar missions is still prohibitively high. So we see the emergence of these low-cost missions, which are really extraordinary, but there are really gaps in unproven and mission-critical technologies that constrain us, and a lot of these gaps are due to cost. So until we can land on the moon reliably, we really need to think about how we can bring that risk curve down. So key enabling technologies that hopefully take us from a 50% mission success rate to something much higher for robotic missions includes lunar position navigation and timing services. So actually having services that enable better safety and mission assurance for the missions that are launching right now. One thing that people don't think about too is ground infrastructure. So higher fidelity simulation tools for autonomous landings, that's a real barrier right now. And that's a problem of not only the ground infrastructure for testing, but also getting better fidelity data as inputs to train those models. So as we see more missions, as we have higher fidelity understanding of the lunar surface and environment, those models will become better over time. We also need to see development in these lightweight, low-cost visual navigation systems that the companies that are emerging right now and smaller nations are using and relying on for blind and autonomous landings. Another big area of investment that is really needed is scalable propulsion systems on a global scale. This includes precision small thrusters for soft landing and in-space maneuvering. I personally spent 4 years in the commercial lunar industry, so working with small firms, and I will say, like, these are real bottlenecks that these firms are facing in terms of the supply chain that enables safer landings. Beyond technology, and like one thing that we're thinking of in the task force is breaking out demand signals from 3 primary sectors. And these are pretty traditional, right? Government, commercial, and science. So you can think about large-scale government-supported anchor programs, which are really necessary for providing the stability, kind of like Charlotte was bringing up, right? Making sure that there's sustained and reliable investment. So in particular, programs like NASA's Artemis program and China's International Lunar Research Station, they're really important because they signal commitments to long-term lunar presence, and that ends up creating stable demands for services like payload delivery, communications, in-situ operations. The other thing, and it kind of goes to the question that was mentioned, is they're building coalitions of smaller national space agencies. So when there are big coalitions of bigger programs, that means that smaller emerging space nations now have an entry point. So you're seeing countries like, we saw a payload from Romania that are able to now afford lunar missions and lunar payloads, and that will only increase as there are these anchor programs, kind of like the ISS model. On the commercial side, we're really focused on ventures that serve markets beyond the space sector. So companies that are actually building technologies or services with terrestrial applications or markets. Many space companies are still building for other space companies, especially in the lunar market. And that kind of creates this circular economy and ecosystem that's really, it is limited, right? That limits your access to capital outside of what's inherent to the space economy. So I want to build on what Bhavya and Victoria have already been mentioning about what's going on, how we think about like terrestrial and low Earth orbit space economy, because it's a reminder that value is about Earth, right? It's about creating value for people on Earth. And the same kind of shift needs to happen with how we think about the cis-lunar economy for it to be truly sustainable. And then finally, science. It's often underestimated as a demand driver, but it's really essential for risk reduction and especially ethical exploration. We wouldn't be where we are right now in terms of the development of what we're seeing with lunar missions without the foundational basic science that was done by the Apollo missions, by a lot of the robotic orbiter missions that we saw in 2000 to 2010s. So you see kind of two different models that are emerging, right? There's the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program from NASA that blends science, but really has a focus on market development. On the other hand, missions from India and China are much more explicitly focused on developing and researching basic science. So you see a lot more publications right now coming out from those missions, which are really going to be helpful for follow-on missions as well. That basic science is important because it gives us better maps, more ground truth, and better understanding of the lunar environment. Again, these are so important for not only development, but responsible development. So we really need to see more support for these science-driven missions as well. So yeah, just to summarize, in the next 5 to 10 years, I think the inflection point will really come when we see just more reliable landings, and then sustained committed investment and especially innovation in terms of what we think and are enabling is possible in those demand areas that I mentioned.
Thank you very much, Meak, for this very concrete and insightful analysis on the cis-lunar economy and specifically on the task force. So closing this topic, I would like to hand over back to Bhavya, asking her, so what is the expected impact of the task force's activities that you are developing, especially on policy recommendations and private investment strategies?
Yeah, I mean, as Alessandro and Mehek so nicely explained, the goal of both the task forces, ISAM and Cis-lunar, is to provide a sharper techno-economic lens through which governments and investors can make better decisions. By the way, please note that these are all bright, young, rising professionals. So the Space Economy Committee is super excited about having them on board. Anyway, back to the task forces. So, and again, I think there's focus on technical feasibility, as Meg just mentioned, but they're not just analyzing technical feasibility of future scenarios. They are laying the groundwork for credible market formation. So ISAM, for example, as Alessandro said, there's a lot of focus still on first principles, definitions, measurement frameworks. And actually, from my perspective, understanding why, despite the interest, the sector hasn't delivered reliable returns. And that's a critical step in informing future investments and guiding policy decisions, even around enabling infrastructure, risk-sharing mechanisms, and technology readiness. For the Cis-lunar task force, I mean, as you heard from Mehek, they're not only developing sort of a structured taxonomy of economic activity, but also technology gaps, areas of investment, demand signals, not just for commercial activity, but also science. The output there will hopefully lay out. And again, I hope that we have good white papers and other ways to disseminate our findings. What are the technology needs for reliable presence on the moon? Investment trend analysis, market gaps, all of them feed into this question of what are the near-term opportunities, what needs to be de-risked, and how do we avoid duplication or strategic drift. And together, and hopefully we'll come back and brief you all again. Together, the two efforts aim to bring, I'm hoping, coherence and credibility to these emerging domains, not by projecting grand futures. We have enough of that going on outside of this committee, but by clarifying where we are today, what is likely to happen next, and what decisions will actually accelerate momentum. And in my view, that's what makes these findings valuable, not just to policymakers and standards bodies, but also to startups and investors and multilateral coalitions trying to chart a sustainable economic path forward in space. Stay tuned.
Thank you very much, Bavia, for summarizing that, and also for launching the second part of the webinar that has also a focus on the investment side. And on that, I would like to call back on stage Luigi and Victoria, asking them, so what investment trends you are observing in the commercial space sector, and also if these investment trends aligned with the interest of the founders working in the space economy, and if they are aligned also with the investors' expectations.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start just by giving a general intro to the subject. So I think if I have to describe, what investors look for specifically in the space sector, I think there's two elements that really drive the interest of prospective investors. So one is basically the scalability potential of the idea that of the concept that the company is bringing forward, how scalable it is, how susceptible it is to growth, right? And the second point, which is very important, and it ties a little bit to the also the point I was making before, potential government contracts. So I think the government contracts play a double role in this case. So on one side, it's a form of reassurance that there is some initial cash flow for the companies, right? But I think most importantly, it's a form of it's a sort of validation that the idea is indeed interesting somehow, and and important to bring forward, because in the end, many investors, of course, are not very specialized on the space sector, right? I mean, it's not easy to understand, okay, which company actually has the edge over the other, right? So the fact that a government entity, either DOD or an agency or whatever, has basically deemed the company worthy of getting a contract, it's a sort of quality validation. Then now, I mean, I think you still in space, like you see still most of the interest going for, let's say, a lot of companies that are operating in the downstream side, right? In trends that you could imagine sort of crosses with the general data economy trend, right? And there you will see tech investors looking at space downstream companies as just another type of investment in a data-driven company. Then of course there's also like a lot of investors looking at the upstream side of the value chain, right? Particularly, access to space is an area that drives quite a lot of interest because, I mean, it's an area extremely strategic, and there is where you see, the importance of some form of government ties or government support for the company as a validation of the let's say, the competitive advantage of that particular company. Then also, I mean, more on the upstream side, of course, there's also interest in specific type of payload development, again, because this brings then a competitive advantage on the market on account of the type of data that it can produce and so on. But maybe I leave it to Victoria to also jump in and not talk too much myself.
Just briefly, maybe to complement, I think it's very aligned, and I would pick up actually on something Luigi said at the beginning. It's that the space sector is very unique. And so when you're an investor trying to approach a sector such as space, which is so broad, with the upstream, the downstream, and different implications and the long lead times in technology development in particular, there is, the part of the space sector itself. So trying to educate or help communicate how the efforts to develop the right technologies and the times required, and that there shouldn't be an expectation that you'll have maybe the same level of multipliers on return on investment as quickly as you might have in other industries. And so bridging that gap is critical and important. And how we talked about making the case for space and linking it to other strategies is also kind of relevant when you're a startup pitching to investors or an investment firm kind of trying to approach a new sector such as space.
Thank you very much, both Luigi and Victoria, for this overview on the investment trends. So moving on, the last part of our webinar. So how both the academic sectors as well as the European Space Agency is supporting the innovation ecosystem. I will address two last questions, one for Alessandro and one for Charlotte, respectively. So Alessandro, being you an academic, how are universities helping to develop the entrepreneurial skills that are needed in the space sector, and what interdisciplinary tools are proving most effective based on your experience?
Yeah, thank you for your question. That's actually a really great question, in a sense that this is a key aspect, is a key mission that we have in university, in academia, is really to form the future workforce that is able to get and to face the challenges that are coming out. So what I've seen is, for example, we launched a new course that is a multidisciplinary, multicultural course between that has to is making students dealing with real problems. So we engage companies that come with a real problem and they have to solve it in a multidisciplinary and multicultural team, ranging from informatics engineers to management students. So the idea is really to help them in understanding that they have to be both able to get the technological skill as well as the managerial one. And now, especially in the space economy, something that you have to get as capabilities and to bring with you. So this is the first aspect that university is doing, especially at teaching level. So there are other universities that are doing something really similar, and is a trend that we are observing. In terms also of entrepreneurial skills, this is something that is fundamental, because what we have seen is that many times, I'm in engineering school, students tend to start a startup that has the unique technology, but then maybe it doesn't solve a problem, or there is no client, or it's too early, or they don't know how to design a business plan. So this is something that is really complement what is needed. And the last one, in terms of academia, is really to create a culture bringing the forefront of the knowledge that we have. So even now in the academic committee on space economy, and you can read a lot of publication on that, there is this movement that say, okay, we have to bring new competencies within the traditional context, as well as try to move and to change a bit, to complement the way we are assessing and valuing, I don't know, the space economy towards something new. How we assess is not just about, as Bhagat said before, not just about the technological feasibility, but also about the economic viability. So, and they have to work together. So it's really, we need to create a culture, and we are creating a culture on that.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. So I will ask for one last input concerning ethics and inclusivity, asking MEAC, what principles should guide the development of an inclusive, ethical, and sustainable investment and governance framework for the space economy, and how can we prevent economic exclusion, especially now that space commercialization is accelerating a lot.
Thank you so much. And this is really foundational work to the work that we do at Open Lunar Foundation. So I'm excited to be able to answer this question, but I will try to keep it short so we can get to the chat questions. First of all, I would say there's so much foundational research that's done in terrestrial economics that we can pull from. So thinking about governing space as a commons and avoiding entrenching first mover advantages, these are problems that have led to structural inequalities on Earth in the economic development that we've seen on a global scale. So as much as we can be very thoughtful about how we ensure that commercial activity is nested in a governance framework that actually recognizes space as a global commons, that will be the way that we ensure accessibility for not only other actors that want to work in the space, but future generations as well. So, you know, as we think about global commons, space, for example, it's a common pool resource. So it has weak property rights, and that means strong potential for tragedy of the commons. Charlotte already brought up all of the space debris problems that we have in low Earth orbit. We have the same concerns about what could happen on the lunar surface. So beyond debris generation, spectrum crowding, resource hoarding, these impose negative externalities. So we want to think about how to temper, you know, those kinds of impulses in the market, and then also solve for including more positive externalities. So how do we ensure that there are new public goods created from the economic activity that's going on? Scientific knowledge, debris mitigation. How do we ensure that these are provided through the private sector, and ensure that privatization and public-private partnerships don't mean that we're socializing our losses and privatizing gains necessarily? That opens up the door for more people to be involved in the economic activities. And then finally, thinking about entrenching first mover advantages, this unfairly privileges early actors. And I know there's a lot of concern from folks on this webinar, for example, of how to ensure space remains accessible to international players beyond the ones that have the ability right now. So information asymmetries build up when we entrench incumbents, and that can distort markets. So when we think about first movers, they might have privileged access to trajectories, landing sites, data about resource reserves. Those advantages can compound over time. So we need to think about, like, how do we actually co-invest in infrastructure so that we build modular and open and interoperable kinds of infrastructures that allow other people to come and be part of the economy rather than pushing people out. So yeah, these are really, really big questions. They are problems that we deal with on Earth. And at Open Lunar, we believe that if we can solve those problems in space, wouldn't that be amazing? And we could bring those lessons back to the problems that we have on Earth. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity to be able to design this economy in a way that's open and preserves access for future generations as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Meak, and thank you all for your insights. We'll now take a few questions from the audience. So Meak, don't go away, because I guess that the first question is addressed to you. So I'm a junior researcher and would like to ask how the space community is thinking of making the space more accessible, as not everyone can spend $100,000.
Yes, this is a really great question. I think that is an intentionality that is really necessary in the space community. And I will say, from the perspective of, you know, we're at the UN and we see a lot of engagement and interest from emerging space nations in figuring out how they can be part of national space programs through programs like the Artemis Accords or China's ILRS. There are two examples that are really exciting. So the UAE has already commissioned private commercial companies to take payloads to the moon for the development of their programs. In South Africa, we've seen a partnership that they've created with the ILRS to develop a radio astronomy payload. So there are really great advantages that we can take in terms of maximizing these really big investments. So an investment in a program like Artemis, right? On Artemis 1, you saw a bunch of CubeSats that were included on that launch that were deployed around lunar orbit. Unfortunately, they were not charged, so that was not the best example, but there are there are new modes of engagement that are emerging. It is the responsibility of those first movers, as I just mentioned, to ensure that we ensure accessibility remains open. So bringing down those costs is a huge driver to making sure that space remains open and accessible to more nations. And that is incumbent on these first movers.
Thank you very much, Meak. We have another question that I guess can be addressed by Luigi. So what are some current underlying challenges in the operations management track of the space sector or the space economy?
On the operational management, what, sorry?
So what are some current underlying challenges in the operations management track of the space sector or the space economy?
I'm not so sure I understand the question. To be honest, I mean, I think, yeah, operations management track of the space sector. So you mean in the midstream, so in operations, in controlling spacecraft and stuff like that? Well, I mean, it's basically it's a sector that is indeed undergoing some changes, right? I mean, there is a trend towards mutualization of, let's say, of the assets needed for operations management, right? So there is a tendency now to have, let's say, the ground segment of space assets mutualized to serve, different needs, and not only dedicated to a single type of asset or a single constellation. So you see a lot of companies actually popping up offering what they call ground segment as a service type of services. But you also see a situation where basically traditional SATCOM providers are carving out their ground segment business in a move that is similar to what has happened in the telecom sector when, for example, the mobile infrastructures were actually spun off from the companies, right? So I think there's a tendency for operations to grow into their own specific industry, if you want, rather than being attached and vertically integrated into, let's say, the satellite business they were with. So, and this is, of course, because there's a multiplication of assets that need operations, and there is volume and capacity. So maybe like having and owning a ground segment facility and not using it to the full extent is an unnecessary expense. So it's better to put it to good use this way. So I don't know if this was the question, but
Thank you, Luigi. We will ask back our participants if we haven't clarified or if we have clarified or not. But I would move to our third question, which is PPP as a growing impact in US with decreasing public funding. New US PPP forms are emerging with forward buying and more design freedom to private sector. Does ESA adopt this trend? So I guess Bavia or Charlotte can go on with that.
Charlotte, go ahead and I'll supplement.
Yes, so I hope you hear me well. So, well, indeed, what I can say is that we see an evolution of industry, of its maturity. We see an evolution of the systems. We see an evolution of the markets, and all of that is obviously leading us to an evolution of our risk sharing as a public authority with respect to the private sector. And so we are indeed also evolving our way of procuring and setting up future businesses. So there is a whole range indeed of new activities that are being looked into with different procurement approach, whether this is service procurement or we have the different examples that are today on LEO or on launchers. But I think this is an open point that is being considered on an ad hoc basis. And Bhavya, if you want to complement.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that public-private partnerships are often treated as silver bullets in space policy, but they really only succeed under specific conditions. For example, there's a clear government customer with defined needs. For example, the NASA COTS program succeeded because NASA needed ISS supply, willing to pay for it, not just fund R&D. Second one is, commercial market is near ready or already exists, and I think a lot of people forget that. And you can do things like have milestone-based payments, which a lot of industry doesn't like. But public-private partnerships also misfire if there is no real commercial market, but just wishful thinking. And oftentimes commercial entities say there's a market, but there may not be. Or if the mission requirements are too bespoke or sensitive. So in a commercial crew is an example where until recently, and again, thank goodness, there wasn't that much of a commercial demand, but it did emerge. And so I think that the key is that don't assume market pull, test for it. Treat PPPs as a tool, not a doctrine, not an ideology. Match the right PPP model to the maturity of the technology and clarify the mission. And prioritize mission alignment and speed over ideology. Those are sort of the so PPPs work, but only under special conditions, and both in the United States, and I don't know enough about Europe, but in the United States, we've had a hit or miss. So we have to be careful about how we proceed with public-private partnerships.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. One very last question that we have that I guess it is addressed to Meak back. So do you have any advice for new space startups?
Yes. Number one, think very carefully if you want to do that. I would say I have advice that's very specific for more hardware-focused companies because that's my experience. So number one, be very careful about what your main technological focus will be and ruthlessly prioritize on that. So think about what you're going to build in-house, what's going to be your core bread and butter, and what you will procure. To do so, you need to understand your supply chain very well. This is very hard in the space industry. Maybe you only have one or two vendors you can rely on for a certain part. That means that you better be at their facility every single day. That is really important. And you need to trust them. Next is to hire very carefully. One bad hire can derail a program much more than you realize. And building up core competencies mean that you need the talent in-house to be able to assess not only the stuff that you're doing in-house, but your vendor performance and what you're doing at the system level. Something that I learned while working at iSpace with their team is that in such a high-risk industry, you need to raise enough capital at the outset to have multiple opportunities to launch. So iSpace raised enough in their Series A to build 2 landers. That meant when they were launching Mission 1, they were moving to integration on Mission 2. That short time frame and that feedback loop means that you're able to internalize and put into practice right away lessons learned that you got on the first mission. That's really important for your workforce as well. And then finally, a lesson from SpaceX, which is probably not replicable, but it's important to understand how, to develop a sustainable company. Think about sustainable demand. So government demand served as an important anchor, but it was ultimately Starlink, which is an internal payload, that actually took advantage of the product that they developed from that government investment, the Falcon 9. So you need to think about demand drivers that address terrestrial, as we talked about, humans, right? So Starlink addresses human demand by providing a service that people want. So really think about that. Yeah, that's what I have.
Perfect, very sharp. So again, thank you to all our panelists from the Space Economy Committee and to the IAF. Today's discussion highlights how the space economy is not just about rockets, but it's just about ecosystem investment frameworks, policy alignment, and human talent. As the IAF Workforce and Young Professional Program Committee, we are committed to continuing this dialogue. So stay tuned because more webinars are coming, and also a recording of this webinar and additional resources will be shared on YouTube. So thank you all once again and for the inspiring conversations, and have all a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.